Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. Today we are discussing something that I have been planning since I began this channel, the first movement of Tchaikovsky's Pathetique Symphony, which is also the subject of roughly 1/4 of my dissertation. Of course, if you're a fan of the channel, or even if you're not, by way of context clues, you can assume we're going to be discussing the sonata form. But I'm also going to be discussing various aspects of Tchaikovsky's approach to sonata forms that are both unique to his compositional style and in direct opposition with established norms. We'll be dipping a toe back into semiotic analysis, and we're also going to be discussing my experiences and some research around a concept known as musical embodiment. Essentially, how the experience of music can be perceived or experienced through the physical sensations of tension, balance, or a lack thereof. For me personally, Tchaikovsky is one of the most physical composers, full stop. So I'm excited to share both some research and how I experience the music. And I would be very interested to hear if your experience of the music is similar or different, so be sure to comment below with your thoughts. As always in my videos, my analysis will be accompanied by a sectioned recording of the work so you can experience the music as well. In this case, I'm going to be using a rather famous recording of this symphony made by Yevgeny Mravinsky and the Leningrad Philharmonic in 1961. In my dissertation, I spent the first chapter discussing the quality of research and analysis around this symphony, but in my opinion, the music is what's most important. If you are interested in biographies of Tchaikovsky's life, those are readily available. And if you're interested in hearing me rant and rave, with evidence, about how homophobia affects Tchaikovsky scholarship, that's available in my dissertation or from writers like Malcolm Brown and Richard Taruskin. So what to label this music? If you are familiar with this symphony, you probably know that the melodic material, if it can be called a melody rather than a motif, in the bassoon reappears as the central motivic material of the primary theme, which weighs the scale more toward the idea of a primary theme zero module, especially when we consider that this music is not at all anchored in a tonic. In fact, the first phrase seems to be circling not the tonic of B minor, but the subdominant of E minor, even attempting to open a half cadence in that same key, the cadence being stymied by the inclusion of a seventh. The seventh implies not the resting pause of a cadence, but action. This is music which is attempting, and in my opinion failing, to accomplish something, which is why I've marked it as doing. This attempt to accomplish something does also weigh the other side of the scale, marked slow introduction. An introduction's main task is to open a dominant preparation for the work as a whole. When the zero module repeats itself, Tchaikovsky reworks the harmony to this time approach a dominant chord in the tonic, which again is denied cadential status by the inclusion of a seventh, this time in the bassoon. Small instrumental choirs repeat these attempts to open a more stable dominant chord, but each ultimately fails. This is why I have chosen to label this section as a P0 module, even though, arguably, the music functions as both zero module and introduction, and as a section which is doing. The music is attempting to accomplish melodic and harmonic stability. Before we move on to the primary theme, let's discuss the idea of embodiment as it appears in this section, using a concept of Steve Larson's called melodic gravity, or in this quote from his book Musical Forces, specifically melodic magnetism. Essentially, Larson is discussing the tendency of melodies to move toward harmonic stability. He uses the example of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. The tonic chord pitches of C, E, and G are the most stable, and when the notes step outside of that frame, they are magnetically pulled back toward the center. The idea behind embodiment in music is that this is not simply happening on a cognitive level, but on a physical level as well, that we experience it as a sensation within the body, similar to our experience of the sensation of actual gravity. We feel the pull of the earth, particularly when we are, say, jumping, and the earth pulls us back toward it. In this section of the symphony, however, a tonality has not yet been established. Of course, cognitively, we know that the symphony is in B minor, but how does the music's failure to establish a centered gravitational pull affect our physical experience of the music? To answer that, I'm going to introduce a second concept that Marc Johnson discusses in his own article on musical embodiment, which is the sensation of balance. Johnson writes that being balanced permits you to function successfully to achieve your ends. If you lose your balance, you tend to lose control of things, such as your ability to stand, walk, and manipulate objects. Losing your balance makes you unstable, and you experience this as a scary feeling of being unsettled and upset. So we have these two concepts, melodic magnetism, or gravity, and the feeling of being balanced or unbalanced. If we apply them to this section of the first movement, my experience is both that I am unsure of where the music is attempting to go melodically and even harmonically, and that experience of uncertainty gives me a sensation of being unbalanced and thus unsettled. This experience of being unbalanced by a lack of coherent gravitational center is going to continue through this music. I've marked the primary theme as being an example of doing again. I would say that this music also fails at what it is attempting to do. At this point, I'd like to remind you that the use of terms like success or failure apply specifically to the music, and are not intended to be comments of Tchaikovsky or his skill as a composer. Tchaikovsky is holding the puppet strings here. The music fails or succeeds according to his expressive goals. I feel this primary theme mirrors the off-kilter sensation we experience in the initial P0 module, just more emphatically. This music is also doing, but again, fails to accomplish its goal, the goal of establishing a tonic key. Before we continue to the transition, which I've marked as a P-TR merge, let's discuss what's unusual about this symphony compared to other works. First, the concept of doing. While we might consider doing to be the standard for a slow introduction, as that music most often seeks to open a dominant chord which leads into the tonic of the primary theme, for an actual primary theme, the idea of doing is, in my opinion, actually deformational. I would expect the primary theme to not be doing anything, but rather to simply exist as the initial condition of the music. This idea dovetails with Hepokoski and Darcy's concept of tonal over and under determination. They write that cadence attainment or non-attainment within P is a crucial aspect of its character. One structural function of P is to set forth an unambiguous tonic. This established tonic will then be briefly subverted in the secondary theme, but finally reattained with the essential structural cadence. We could therefore consider Tchaikovsky's primary theme to be tonally underdetermined. Although the tonality of the theme in B minor is perfectly clear, established by the half cadence here, it has not been clearly established by a strong cadence in the tonic, or in this case, even a weak cadence in the tonic. The sense of imbalance continues through the theme, along with the sense of doing. Another unusual aspect of this exposition I'd like to quickly point out is the instrumentation. In my experience, it is common for orchestral sonata forms to open the primary theme with strings accompanied by winds. But in this symphony, as in other symphonies by Tchaikovsky, it is the winds which open the movement. The bassoon in the P0 module, accompanied by basses, and flute and clarinet in the actual primary theme, accompanied by viola, cello, and bass. The violin actually doesn't appear in the symphony until the transition. As the transition unfolds, sequences, a typical element of transitions, are really turned up to 11. As the motivic material from P0 dissolves even farther, the violins rocket upward, reaching an apex here. Notice that although the first half of this measure is an outline of a B minor chord, the violins are unaccompanied in the second half and sound D and F sharp, an initial gambit at heading toward the major mediant, which the orchestra actually accepts. Although not seventh chords, the following music is centered around motions from A major to D major. The winds, re-entering a few bars later, quickly undermine this positive move and instead focus around F sharp and C sharp minor, making moves towards the more tragically charged minor dominant key. Continuing with the tension created by the lack of a tonal center of gravity, the transition does not actually manage to modulate into any specific key until the very moments leading into the caesura, and arguably, not even then. If we rewind a little, this extremely tempestuous transition is a perfect example of how this concept of embodiment in music can play out. Johnson writes that a melodic line that continues to rise in pitch well above the middle range may create in us a sense of increasing tension. If we couple this rise in pitch with a crescendo, then the buildup of tension intensifies even more. Depending on the context, increasing or decreasing the tempo can increase the tension. The transition up to this point has essentially been one long rise in pitch and volume, culminating in a final increase in tempo, which actually, in this context, I would say functions as an escape valve. Because the actual amount that pitch can be raised is finite, Tchaikovsky has instead slowly added instruments and taken each additional instrument into an extreme of its register. This pinched sound quality of instruments playing at extremes also increases the felt tension. The moment when the actual pinnacle is reached, in bar 73, is the first moment that I feel the music switches from doing to not doing. The sequential motion is now completely arrested and centered around A, at first in the form of a second inversion chord, and finally in an actual pedal, which leads into the medial caesura. Ironically, although I think it's fair to say that this is a pedal, it's not actually a dominant chord. The chord outlines in the viola are actually a tonic chord in D major, ending on a high F sharp. This inability to clearly articulate any tonality is an extension of the missing gravitational center from the primary theme. In many ways, this secondary theme approaches the Platonic ideal of a secondary theme in Romantic era sonata form, lush and melodically flowing, not at all developmental, and in many ways, completely the opposite of the motivic and stormy primary theme. However, this lack of energy and drive is also this iteration of the theme's undoing. Immediately we are held in a sense of stasis by the prolonged tonic pedal in low voices, stymieing the first attempt at cadence here. Then, marked incalzando, meaning to press or urge onward, the violin jumps up an octave, increasing the embodied tension and forcing the bass into action, flickering the theme into doing. This time, it's the melody which fails in its task. Although this is a cadence, it is an imperfect cadence, meaning the tonic is in the bass, but not the soprano. Although in the Elements of Sonata Theory, Hepokoski and Darcy write that, quote, although rare, it is possible for an EEC to be more weakly secured by an IAC, end quote, I have spoken before on this channel about how I would tend to disagree. Maybe I'm a purist, but I think the only successful essential cadence option is the perfect authentic cadence, and all other options fall rhetorically short, even if they do fulfill the tonal goal of a sonata. Whichever way you lean, the bottom line is that an imperfect authentic cadence either just barely achieves an essential closure, or just barely falls short of achieving it. In the case of this symphony, however, I think I have both God and anime on my side given the layout of the remainder of the exposition, and every reiteration of the secondary theme. This section poses another labeling problem. From analyzing other Tchaikovsky symphony first movements, I can tell you that he often employs both a trimodular block and three-key exposition. This exposition is not three-key, but we can say it's in dialogue with the concept of a trimodular block. This theme can be regarded as either S1.2 or possibly a second transition. While slowly increasing in energy throughout, this section actually threatens to collapse into both the original tonic of B minor and the much more negatively charged parallel D minor, both cadences narrowly avoided by one or another voice evading the cadence. This section is also a perfect illustration of another concept of Steve Larson in his book Musical Forces. He notes that in addition to musical gravity having the effect of destabilizing and stabilizing certain pitches in reference to a tonic, this force also shapes both melodic lines and our perception of those lines, essentially in a what goes up must come down way. The melody, which appears in the winds, ascends and then rapidly descends, almost tumbling back down to its origin point. Here again, Tchaikovsky has put a unique twist on this. Larson notes that a common tendency is for melodies to rise by large intervals and descend by small intervals, but Tchaikovsky has done the opposite. While maintaining the sense of gravitational pull on the melody, he has ascended by step and descended by leap. The main issue with calling this form a trimodular block is the music which follows this potential second medial caesura moment. This second attempt at the S theme is what throws a wrench in the trimodular block idea, and also greatly strengthens my belief that the previous IAC was representative of a failure. Had it been successful, the symphony would have simply moved into closing zone. Instead, Tchaikovsky gave us a transitional section followed by a repetition of the initial secondary theme, which is at once more energetic and more imbalanced. The octave higher register of the theme, combined with the more active accompaniment, pulsing triplets, adds tension to the theme, but the lack of any downbeat in the accompaniment, note the repeated eighth rest at the beginning of every bar line and on the third beat, deny not so much a tonal sense of gravitational pull, but a rhythmic sense. We are floating in space without any tether to a metric reality. Proving it's always possible to give the knife one more twist, Tchaikovsky ratchets up the tension another degree, tossing the violins up another octave, urging the bass line forward toward a cadence, even as the melody is trapped by fate to repeat the same contour of the previous iteration in S1.1. An essential aspect of this secondary theme's character is its static inertness. When the secondary theme's attempt at cadence allies with the closing theme, we are in, if possible, an even worse situation than the closing of the prior theme. Again, the fifth rather than the tonic is in the soprano voice, but additionally, there is no actual pitch on the downbeat in bass voices. It again follows one eighth rest after. Best case scenario, this essential closure point is an extremely weak IAC. Worst case, it isn't there at all, and there's no cadence. I think whichever way you prefer to look at it, the layout of this exposition is a good example of how the minor mode doesn't have an exclusive monopoly on the tragic or negative. This theme is very obviously squarely in D major, which is the most desirous key of a minor mode sonata, and yet its inability to secure expositional closure makes this tragic. The closing theme which follows is both distinct from the secondary theme and an interesting case study in the idea of melodic gravitational pull that we've been discussing. Although in the macro, the melody consistently heads downward, releasing us from the tension of the unresolved secondary theme, in the micro, each beat includes a yearning upward gesture in the melody. This is followed by an example of a concept I know we've discussed, and I've rejected as a possibility before: closing theme as secondary theme aftermath. Previously, I rejected this concept as an explanation in my analysis of Schubert's Death in the Maiden. It was my interpretation that the reappearance of the S theme after the essential cadence had the effect of negating that cadence, and thus of making the sonata form a failure. In this situation, however, the exposition is already a failure, and furthermore, this section conforms exactly to Hepokoski and Darcy's definition of the concept, a piano-dynamic return to the initial S1.1 theme, and it even occurs after a distinct closing theme, which they mention here. In addition, the theme is possibly even more harmonically and melodically inert than the initial S. It occurs only over a tonic pedal. I've chosen to describe it to you before playing it because this theme, quiet in the extreme, is followed by an extremely bombastic opening to a development-like section. Although it can be a little fun to watch anyone lulled into peace by Tchaikovsky jump out of their skin in the concert hall, in a video it seems a little less appropriate. So if you're using headphones, beware. sonata is a useful example of how sonata theory can not only be applied to sonatas well into the 19th, and I would argue 20th, centuries, but that some aspects of sonata identification would be practically impossible without it. In my survey of various analyses of this movement for my dissertation, I came across endless iterations of reversed recapitulations, truncated recapitulations, and all manner of labels, and not a single mention of the Type 2 sonata. And as a reminder, I completed my dissertation and received my doctorate in 2020, fully 13 years after the publication of the Elements of Sonata Theory in 2007. There was ample time to apply this theory to Tchaikovsky's music. When one is armed with sonata theory, the identification of this symphony's sonata type becomes almost a matter of course. The only thorn in the subtype is this brief link between the end of the first rotation and the beginning of the second, lasting about 8 to 9 bars. But Hepokoski and Darcy even cover this, providing an 18th century example in the form of a Mozart string quartet. Beginning in D minor, an audible retraction of the major mode of the secondary theme, this section will, in many ways, repeat the layout of the transition from the first rotation, moving from sparse forces in lower registers and increasing tension by raising the pitch and increasing instrumental forces. Marked feroce, or with ferocity, you can almost hear bow strings breaking as the strings launch back into the motif of the primary theme. Tchaikovsky moves through two sections which increase the tension, allow it to dissipate, and increase it again, before moving into a section which bears a striking resemblance to the moment of medial caesura in the exposition. The G-flat could even be enharmonically respelled as the F-sharp dominant of B. Rather than moving on to the secondary theme, however, the primary theme returns in a far more sinister guise. It's completely dropped its sequential mantle and is now darkly static, repeating itself 3 times without any upward motion, uniquely different than any of its other appearances in this symphony. While previously the sequential rising motion increased tension, I would argue that it is now such a norm that it has essentially become the expectation, leaving the subversion of that expectation as the only option for recreating physical tension. Following this, the brass, for the first time, will take up the primary theme, propelling us forward and into the retransition, a gut-wrenching passage over an F-sharp pedal, which will eventually become a dominant chord leading to B major and a tonic iteration of the secondary theme. Continuing Johnson's idea of tempo affecting physical tension, Tchaikovsky will use expanded rhythmic values to give the sense of having the tempo. In a counterpart to the increase in tempo acting as an escape valve to our tension, slowing the tempo before ending the development increases the felt stress of this moment. I would say the transformation between the secondary themes in the first and second rotation are their position on the semiotic square that we discussed in my video on Chopin's Ballade, which I'll link below. While in the first rotation, the secondary theme was being, it was mainly just inertly existing, this theme seems to lean more toward the corner of doing. Unfortunately, even as much of the accompaniment is infused with energy, the chromatic scale has a destabilizing effect on the tonal gravity of the theme, throwing everything off-center. When this theme reappears, it is always equipped with a more positive trait and a more negative trait that tend to cancel each other out. Strengthening my argument for viewing the IAC as first expositional failure and now sonata failure, observe how the music reacts to the initial imperfect cadence. We are not moving into the closing theme. Rather, Tchaikovsky is reinvigorating the theme with the energy inherent in this register and gathers forces for another attempt at cadence, which, as you can see, 5 bars after rehearsal letter S, ultimately also fails. The closing theme, though distinct from the C theme in rotation 1, shares that theme's downward melodic trajectory and also the micro-motions upward, this time to chromatic neighbor tones rather than leaps of a third or fourth. This is followed by another example of C as S aftermath. Although arguably the inner voices of bassoon and flute are more harmonically active, this is ultimately for naught, as the pedal in French horn and timpani are still the tonic B. The S aftermath is followed by a coda which, to my ear, and this is purely my interpretation, has the feeling of a desolate major mode, like we discussed in Schubert's song Gute Nacht. There's something eerily funereal about the music, and the repeated attempts at cadence which, again fail, in brass and woodwinds, only reinforces that feeling for me. The most unique aspect of Tchaikovsky's sonata forms is not actually the layout of the sonata. We've discussed several Type 2 sonatas just on this channel. What's unique is how Tchaikovsky subverts our expectations for how individual sections of his sonata form are presented and behave. He has a tendency to make the primary theme an actor rather than simply the initial condition. Tchaikovsky's primary themes are often just as flawed as his secondary themes, making it all the more devastating when the sonata is unable to reach essential closure. Likewise, his secondary themes, often presented as impotent and static, are unable to change and adapt to reach cadence. His use of instrumentation is also unique. This is really my own theory, but broadly, I find that composers tend to use orchestral forces in a pattern within a symphonic sonata, that the primary theme is introduced by the strings, and the secondary theme by winds. Tchaikovsky reverses that expectation in this movement and a number of his other works. In addition to those traits, Tchaikovsky is, to me, a very physical or embodied composer. I've argued in this video that he plays on our bodily sensations by using musical gravity or magnetism to unsettle and unbalance our sense of equilibrium while experiencing the work. But this is something I'm particularly interested to hear from you about. If you experience any of this musical embodiment, or if you don't, please let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video analysis of the first movement of Tchaikovsky's First Symphony. On the screen right now, you can see my patrons. If you are able to support the channel, consider heading over to patreon.com/sonatashewrote, and as always, please don't forget to subscribe.